Ethan, a 13-year-old boy, lives a life no child should ever experience. While most kids are at school or playing in parks, Ethan roams bustling streets collecting cans and bottles to support his sick mother in a narrow, forgotten alleyway. But little does he know his life is about to change drastically. A bridge, an unexpected act, and an encounter with a man on the brink of despair mark the beginning of a journey that will transform not only Ethan's destiny, but also the lives of everyone around him. Stay with us until the end to discover how courage and hope can bloom in even the darkest places. Ethan felt the weight of the canvas bag on his back as he navigated the maze of dark alleys. In the city, the recyclable materials he had collected throughout the day clinked with every step, a constant reminder of his daily struggle. He looked up at the grayish sky, where the city lights drowned out any hint of stars. This was the path he walked every night, always hurrying to get home before Clara needed him. When he finally reached the small makeshift tent crafted from torn tops and wooden planks, he hesitated for a moment. The faint sound of his mother's cough pierced through the thin fabric, tightening his chest. He opened the entrance carefully, ducking to step inside. "Mom, I'm back," he announced, trying to sound more cheerful than he felt. Clara lay on the old mattress that almost blended into the dirt floor. Her tired, sunken eyes turned to him with a faint smile. "Ethan, you took a while," she said in a low, raspy voice. "I was worried. I just wanted to get more stuff today. You know how it is, the more I gather the better," he replied, dropping the bag in the corner. He moved closer to her, examining her closely. "You look more tired today. How are you feeling?" Tried to sit up, but a fit of coughing made her sink back onto the mattress. Ethan quickly placed a hand on her back to steady her. "Don't worry about me, Ethan," she said between coughs. "You already do so much. I should be strong." "But stop it, Mom," he interrupted firmly. "You are strong. You raised me on your own, remember? And I promised I'd take care of you, no matter what." Clara smiled faintly, but tears began to form in her eyes. "You're just a child. You shouldn't have to carry this burden. It's not fair to you. Fair or not, this is our life," Ethan said, grabbing a water bottle and helping her drink. "And I'm going to make things better. One day we'll leave this place, I promise." Silence fell between them for a moment, broken only by the sound of the wind outside. Ethan tried to hide his worry by busying himself with organizing the few belongings they had. He picked up a dented can of soup he had found and began preparing it over a small makeshift fire. "What did you find today?" Clara asked, trying to shift the focus of the conversation. "A few good bottles, some metal pieces that should be worth something," he replied, "and a piece of bread someone threw away. It's still good." He held up the bread wrapped in paper, like it was a treasure. "You should eat all of it, Ethan. You need it more than I do," Clara insisted. "No way, we're sharing. And I already ate some on the way." He lied, smiling to reassure her. Clara knew he was lying, but she didn't have the strength to argue. As the soup warmed up, Ethan sat beside Clara, holding her hand. "Mom, do you remember when we had that tiny apartment before everything fell apart?" he asked, a nostalgic glint in his eyes. Clara nodded, her gaze lost in memories. "I remember. You loved that old couch. You'd spend hours reading your books there. I wish I could give that back to you." "I don't need a couch or books right now," he replied. "I just need you as long as we're together. We'll figure it out." Clara squeezed his hand with surprising strength despite her frailty. "You're my strength, Ethan. I just wish I could do more for you." The soup was ready, and Ethan served a portion for Clara in an improvised bowl. He watched her eat slowly, each spoonful seeming like a monumental effort. When she finished, Clara rested back on the mattress, exhausted. Before closing her eyes, she looked at Ethan. "You deserve so much more than this life, but I can't give it to you. Forgive me," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Ethan leaned down and kissed her forehead. "You've already given me everything that matters, Mom. I'll take care of the rest." Outside, the night had fully settled, bringing with it a biting cold. Ethan adjusted the old blanket over Clara, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. He lay down next to her, staring at the makeshift ceiling. The wind howled through the cracks, but the sound felt distant against the weight of his thoughts. Despite his exhaustion, he knew sleep would be difficult. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, but he was determined to face them. As Clara breathed softly beside him, Ethan whispered to himself, "I'll change this. I have to change it." The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Ethan left the alley with his empty sack. He adjusted the straps on his shoulders, feeling the morning chill bite through his thin cotton shirt. His worn-out shoes with soles nearly gone stepped cautiously on streets, still damp from the previous night's rain. Every step was calculated. He knew exactly where to find the best spots to scavenge. His first destination was a public square where trash bins often overflowed. Ethan approached one of them, already imagining what he might find. As he rummaged through the pile, a harsh voice called out behind him, "Hey kid, what do you think you're doing there?" The voice belonged to a security guard, a large, stern-looking man with an expression hardened by disdain. "I'm just taking things no one wants anymore," Ethan replied without looking up, trying to keep his tone calm. "This bin isn't for you. Get out of here before I call the police," the man threatened, crossing his arms. Ethan felt the familiar wave of humiliation rise, but he didn't argue. He simply lowered his head, grabbed his sack, and walked away quickly. His heart was heavy, but there was no time to dwell on it. Clara needed him, and the day was still long. He made his way to a busy commercial area where shopkeepers often left boxes and scraps out in the open. But he wasn't the only one there. Other scavengers had already arrived, some older and more experienced, others as young as him. Ethan tried to find a corner where he could work without bothering anyone. That's when he saw Rawl. The old scavenger was crouched next to a pile of metal, carefully sorting through it. Rawl was a well-known figure on the streets. His graying hair and wrinkled face told stories of decades of hardship, but there was something in his eyes, a sharpness that time hadn't dulled. "Hey kid, come over here," Rawl called without looking up from his work. Ethan hesitated for a moment, but walked closer. "You're doing it wrong." "Wrong?" Ethan asked, puzzled. "Yes. There's no point rummaging through just anything. The trick is knowing what to look for," Rawl explained, holding up a piece of aluminum. "Look at this. It's lightweight, but worth more than most of the junk you'll find around." Ethan nodded, watching Rawl's every move. The old man seemed to know each piece of material like an old friend. "Thanks," Ethan murmured, picking up a nearby can and inspecting it under the light. "You're new to this, aren't you?" Rawl asked finally, looking at the boy. "How old are you?" 13, Ethan replied cautiously. 13, and already living like you're 50, Rawl said with a bitter laugh. "The streets are cruel, kid. They'll swallow you whole if you let them. But you seem to have something most don't." "What's that?" Ethan asked, intrigued. "The will to survive," Rawl said seriously. "That makes all the difference." The two continued working side by side for some time. Rawl shared small tips and tricks, teaching Ethan how to spot more valuable materials and avoid hidden danger in the alleys and trash bins. Despite the harshness of his words, there was an underlying kindness that Ethan began to respect. Before they parted ways, Rawl handed Ethan a small aluminum can. "It's not much, but it's a start. Dignity isn't about what you have, it's about what you do with it." Ethan took the can, surprised. "Thank you, sir. Call me Rawl," the old man said with a nod. "And be careful. These streets don't forgive the careless." Ethan continued his route, feeling a bit more hopeful. His sack began to fill slowly, and the weight on his shoulders seemed lighter. He replayed Rawl's words in his mind, finding comfort in the old man's wisdom. It was almost nightfall by the time Ethan returned home. The alley was colder than it had been that morning, and Clara waited for him, wrapped in the old blanket he had left behind. "You were out late today," she said as he entered. "I met someone who helped me," Ethan replied with a smile. "A man named Rawl. He taught me how to do this better." Clara smiled, though her face betrayed the exhaustion of a day spent waiting. "It's good to know there are still good people out there." "Yeah," Ethan agreed, sitting down beside her and emptying his sack. "Today was better than yesterday. Tomorrow will be even better." He began sorting through the items he would sell the next day. As Clara watched him despite their hardships, there was something different in Ethan's eyes. That night, a spark of determination, maybe even a glimmer of hope. But the promise of a better tomorrow never came without challenges. Ethan knew that. Still, as he looked at Clara, he resolved to do whatever it took to keep that hope alive. Ethan's legs burned with exhaustion as he trudged across the bridge, his sack now heavy with the day's finds. The sun had long since set, leaving the city bathed in a cold artificial glow. His breath formed small clouds in the chilly night air, but he barely noticed. His thoughts were on Clara, how she was faring, whether she had eaten, and how she had looked weaker than usual that morning. The bridge was quiet, save for the occasional hum of a car speeding past. Ethan liked this part of his walk home. The rhythmic sound of his steps on the worn concrete gave him a moment to think, to dream. He stopped in the middle of the bridge, leaning over the Railing to gaze at the city below, the lights from buildings and cars sparkled like stars against the dark backdrop. He imagined a life beyond the alley, a small apartment for him and Clara, warm meals, and no more scavenging. A faint sound broke through his thoughts. A sob. Ethan froze, his ears straining against the quiet. He turned his head toward the source, his heart quickening there. At the far end of the bridge, a figure stood by the railing, leaning precariously over it. It was an older man, his shoulders hunched, his frame trembling, as though carrying a weight far heavier than Ethan's sack. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure what to do or say. But something in him refused to walk away, tightening his grip on the sack. He stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," he called, his voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Ethan quickened his pace, his heart pounding harder with each step. "Sir, are you okay?" The man finally turned his head just enough for Ethan to catch a glimpse of his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, his cheeks streaked with tears. His lips quivered as he muttered, "Leave me alone, boy. This doesn't concern you." Ethan Southwest swallowed hard, his mind racing. He could feel the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. "It does concern me," he said firmly, stepping closer. "I don't know what's going on, but you shouldn't be out here like this. It's cold and dangerous." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Dangerous? That's the point." His hands gripped the railing tighter, and Ethan's stomach churned. "You don't have to do this," Ethan blurted, his voice rising in urgency. He dropped his sack and reached out a hand, though he dared not get too close. "Whatever it is, it can get better. My mom always says, as long as we're alive, we can fight." The man turned fully now, his face etched with despair. "Fight for what? There's nothing left for me. I've lost everything, my family, my home, everything that mattered." Ethan felt a pang of recognition. He didn't know this man's story, but understood that feeling, losing things that seemed irreplaceable. "I've lost a lot too," he said softly. "My dad left us, my mom's sick. I spend every day picking through trash just to keep us alive." He paused, his voice faltering. "But I keep going, because if I don't, who will?" The man stared at Ethan, his brows furrowed as though trying to process the boy's words. Ethan took a careful step closer, his hand still outstretched. "I don't know you, sir, but I can tell you're someone who's mattered to people. And if you give up now, you'll never know what could change." For a long, agonizing moment, the man said nothing. The wind whipped around them, carrying the distant sounds of the city. Then slowly he released his grip on the railing and stepped back. His shoulders sagged as if the fight had left him entirely. Ethan let out a shaky breath. He hadn't realized he was holding. He moved quickly to the man's side, gently taking his arm to guide him away from the edge. "Come on," he said softly, "let's sit down." They sank onto the cold concrete near the railing. The man buried his face in his hands, his body racked with silent sobs. Ethan sat quietly beside him, not knowing what else to do but to be there. After a few minutes, the man spoke, his voice horrid. "My name's Augustus," he said, lifting his head slightly. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." "I'm Ethan," the boy replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his throat. "And I don't have all the answers, but I think maybe it helps to talk about it." Augustus looked at him, his eyes searching Ethan's face for the first time. There was a flicker of something besides despair. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe even hope. He nodded slowly. "All right, Ethan, I'll talk." And so, under the dim glow of the street lights, Augustus began to share his story. Ethan listened intently, his own burdens momentarily forgotten as he focused on the man beside him. Augustus' voice trembled as he began his story, his words weighed down by grief and regret. Ethan listened intently, his small figure huddled beside the man on the cold concrete of the bridge. "I wasn't always like this," Augustus said, staring at the ground, as if the memories were etched there. "I had a family, a wife, a daughter. We lived in a big house, had everything we needed. But I was too consumed by work. I thought I was providing for them. But I wasn't really there." Ethan nodded slowly, his mind briefly wandering to his own struggles with Clara. He couldn't imagine what it would feel like to lose her entirely. "I didn't even realize is how distant I'd become," Augustus continued, his voice cracking, "until it was too late. My wife, she left, took our daughter with her. I thought I'd have time to fix things." But his words caught in his throat, and he took a shaky breath. "There was an accident, a drunk driver. They were both gone just like that." Ethan felt his chest tighten, his own pain mirrored in Augustus's words. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet, letting Augustus speak. "I stopped caring after that, lost my job, the house, everything. And tonight Augustus' voice trailed off as he glanced toward the railing. Tonight, I thought maybe it was time to stop fighting. You don't have to, Ethan said softly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. I know it feels impossible right now, but there's always something worth holding on to, someone who needs you. Like who? Augustus asked bitterly. I'm just a shell of who I was. No one even knows I exist anymore. I know, Ethan replied firmly. And I think you could help someone like me. Augustus looked at him confused. Help you? What do you mean? Ethan hesitated, unsure how much to share. But there was something about Augustus, something in the brokenness they'd both carried that made him feel safe enough to open up. My mom's sick. He began, really sick. And it's just me taking care of her. I spend every day collecting cans and bottles to make enough for food and medicine. Sometimes it feels like I'm drowning, like I'll never catch up. But I can't give up because she needs me. Augustus stared at Ethan, his expression softening. You're just a boy, he said quietly. You shouldn't have to carry that weight. Maybe not, Ethan admitted then, but I do. And if I can find a reason to keep going, so can you. Maybe we can figure it out together. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city hummed around them, its indifference both comforting and cruel. Augustus rubbed his hands together, as if trying to summon warmth from the cold night air. You're wise beyond your years, Ethan, he finally said. I don't know what I can do to help, but I'll try. Ethan smiled faintly, relief washing over him. That's all anyone can ask for. They sat there a while longer, the heaviness in the air lifting ever so slightly. Augustus's shoulders, once hunched in defeat, straightened a little as he leaned back against the railing. Ethan, despite his exhaustion, felt a strange sense of peace for the first time in a long time. He wasn't facing the night alone. As the chill deepened, Ethan stood and reached out a hand to Augustus. Come on, it's late. Let's get you somewhere safe. Augustus hesitated before taking Ethan's hand. Together they left the bridge, walking side by side into the dimly lit streets. The path ahead was uncertain, but for now they had each other, and that was enough. The alley was quieter than usual when Ethan and Augustus arrived. Augustus slowed his steps as they approached the small makeshift tent, his eyes scanning the surroundings with growing unease. The sight of the tattered tarps and scattered belongings painted a grim picture, one that Ethan knew all too well. This is where you live? Augustus asked softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. Ethan nodded as he set his sack down by the entrance. Yeah, it's not much, but it keeps the wind out most nights. My mom's inside. Augustus hesitated, his gaze lingering on the tent. Does she know you're out this late doing all this? Ethan shrugged. She knows I have to. She's not strong enough to work, and the medicine isn't cheap, so I do what I can. Without waiting for a response, Ethan ducked inside the tent. Mom, I'm back, he called, his voice gentle. Clara stirred on the thin mattress, her face pale and damp with sweat. When her eyes fluttered open, she offered a weak smile. You're late, she murmured, her voice barely audible. I know, no, Ethan replied, sitting beside her. I brought someone with me. He helped me tonight. He turned to the entrance and motioned for Augustus to come in. The older man ducked hesitantly under the low tarp, his tall frame awkwardly folding to fit in the cramped space. Clara's eyes widened slightly as she looked at Augustus. Who this is? Augustus, Ethan explained quickly. I met him on the bridge. He needed some help too. Augustus shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. I'm sorry for intruding, he said, his voice low. Your son, he's something special. He has more courage than most men I've met. Clara's gaze softened as she looked back at Ethan. He gets that from his father, she said quietly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Even if his father forgot how to use it. Ethan busied himself unpacking the sack, not wanting to linger on the mention of his father. I'll make some soup, he said, pulling out a dented can. It's not much, but we'll share. As Ethan worked, Asta sat cross-legged near Clara, his hands resting on his knees. You're lucky to have him, he said after a moment. He's doing more than most grown men would. Clara's smile faltered. I know, and I hate that he has to. He deserves more than this, more than I can give. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. Mom, don't start that again. We've got what we need, and now we've got Augustus too. Augustus looked at Ethan, then at Clara. He's right, he said, a new resolve in his voice. You're not alone in this anymore. If you'll let me, I want to help. Clara blinked, her tired eyes narrowing slightly. Help? How? I don't have much left, Augustus admitted, but I do have some money. It's not enough to change the world, but it can make a difference. Here, food, medicine, proper clothes. These are things I can provide. Ethan froze the can of soup, still in his hands. Why would you do that? You don't even know us. Augustus met his gaze, his expression sincere. Because someone once gave me a second chance, and I squandered it. Meeting you tonight reminded me of what I lost and what I might still be able to do. If I can help you, maybe it'll mean something. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head. We can't accept charity. I don't want Ethan to feel like we're just surviving on someone else's kindness. It's not charity, Augustus said firmly. It's a partnership. You've already helped me more than you realize. And I think helping you might give me a reason to keep going. Ethan set the can down and walked over to sit beside Clara. He took a hand in his young fingers, wrapping gently around hers. Mom, please. We need this. You need this. Clara looked at him, her expression a mix of love and pain. Finally, she nodded. All right, she whispered. If it's for you, I'll accept. Augustus exhaled, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Good. First thing tomorrow, I'll get some supplies, real food, proper medicine. We'll figure this out. For the first time in what felt like for forever, Ethan felt a flicker of hope as he prepared the soup. He couldn't help but glance at Augustus, now sitting quietly with a determined look on his face. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to change as the three of them shared the modest meal. The tent seemed a little warmer. The wind outside still howled, but inside there was a new sense of purpose. Ethan didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he didn't feel so alone. The morning sunlight seeped through the thin layers of the tent, casting faint golden streaks over Clara's sleeping form. Ethan stirred awake, his body aching from another night. On the hard ground he sat up slowly, careful not to disturb his mother, and saw Augustus sitting just outside the tent, his back against the wall of the alley. The older man held a small notebook in his hands, its pages worn and edges frayed. Ethan stepped out, rubbing his eyes. You didn't sleep? He asked. Augustus shook his head, his eyes fixed on the notebook. I haven't been able to in years, he admitted quietly. Too many thoughts, too much regret. Ethan sat beside him, the cool morning air biting at his skin. What's that? He asked, nodding toward the notebook. Augustus hesitated before handing it over. It's what's left of my old life. Notes, addresses, ideas for things I was supposed to do. I've carried it with me, even when I didn't know why. Ethan flipped through the pages, most of them filled with neat handwriting. Among the lists and reminders, there were names circled, addresses crossed out, and scribbled phrases like "never enough time looks important," Ethan said, handing it back. It was. Augustus replied, tucking the notebook into his coat. But now, I think it's time to start over. They sat in silence. For a moment, the city slowly waking around them. The distant sound of cars and footsteps echoed through the alley. Augustus finally stood, brushing dust off his coat. Come on, we've got work to do. Ethan followed him, his curiosity piqued. Augustus led him through the city streets, stopping at a small grocery store. First, the older man handed Ethan a basket and began filling it with essentials: bread, canned soup, fresh fruit, and a small container of honey. Your mother will need this, Augustus explained, holding up the honey. It'll soothe her throat. Ethan stared at the growing pile in awe. This is a lot. Are you sure you can afford it? Augustus nodded, though a hint of doubt crossed his face. It's what needs to be done. Don't worry about the cost. They moved on to a pharmacy, where Augustus purchased a small bag of medicine. He read the labels carefully, ensuring they matched the symptoms Ethan had described. By the time they returned to the alley, Ethan's arms were full of supplies he could scarcely believe were his. When they entered the tent, Clara was awake, her frail body propped against a stack of old clothes. Her eyes widened at the sight of the groceries and medicine. What is all this? She asked, her voice horror, but tinged with surprise. It's for you, Augustus said, setting the bags down. Ethan told me about your condition. This should help. Clara looked at the items, then at Augustus. Tears welled in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. You don't have to, Augustus replied gently. You just focus on getting better. As Ethan unpacked the groceries, he noticed a small smile on his mother's face, something he hadn't seen in weeks. Augustus handed her a mug of warm tea sweetened with honey, and she sipped it slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing with each drink. For the next few days, Augustus became a constant presence in their lives. He brought more supplies, repaired the tent's fraying edges, and even managed to find a second-hand blanket to keep Clara warmer at night. Ethan watched as his mother's health began to improve. Little by little, her coughs grew